Okay, good afternoon, and welcome to the Europe Center. My name is Christophe Crombez, and I'm very happy to introduce our speaker for today, Andrea Aldrich from Yale University. She will be talking about gender and party leadership change. A few words about Andrea. As I mentioned, Andrea is joining us from Yale. Her research interests are political representation, gender, and comparative political institutions. She has published on issues like internal political party dynamics and legislative representation, the influence of internal party organization on gender equality in elections and party leadership. She has published in the Journal of Common Market Studies recently, as well as Party Politics and Politics and Gender. Before being at Yale, she was a postdoc at the University of Houston. Andrea will be talking for 30, 40, 45 minutes, something like that. And then we will have some time for Q&A. If you want to ask some questions, also the members of our community who are joining us online, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. You can already do that while Andrea is talking. And then when Andrea is done with her presentation, I will go through the questions that the audience online has raised. All right, Andrea, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. And thank you for the invitation to come here today to present. So as Christophe said, I'm going to present today on gender and party leadership change. This is a project that I'm working on with Zeynep Somer-Topsu at the University of Texas, Austin. We've been working on this project for a while, trying to explore some of the dynamics about women party leaders and how they might be different than men party leaders. And so I'm going to start the presentation today with a little bit of a motivating story about women in party politics, and talk about two women party leaders in particular. So as you can see here, this is a picture of Margaret Thatcher, who was the very first leader of the Conservative Party in the UK and the first female prime minister in the UK. And this is her with her party colleague, Edward Heath. When she became party leader in 1975, she beat Edward Heath in a party contest to become the leader. At the time, the Conservative Party was struggling, sort of in the public and electoral sphere. There was a lot of economic turmoil in the UK at the time. Edward Heath, as party leader and as prime minister, was dealing with a lot of labor strikes, and he called a series of elections to try to bolster support for the Labour Party. In the second of these elections, the Labour Party actually lost the government, and that was when Margaret Thatcher was able to challenge him for the leadership and gain her spot. Once she became party leader, she has been one of the longest serving women party leaders in Europe, if not the longest. I don't know that for certain. And she served as party leader from 1975 until 1990. She was prime minister at the time from 1979 until 1990. And in 1990, she resigned as both the prime minister and the party leader after some internal party pressure to get some new blood into the party. After Thatcher, there were no more women leading the Conservative Party until we came to Theresa May, who became Conservative Party leader in 2016. Now, 2016 was sort of the before times, before the pandemic, so we might not remember all the way back to 2016, but Theresa May became party leader under similarly trying circumstances for the Conservative Party. At the time, David Cameron had just called for the referendum on Brexit. He lost this referendum when the UK voted to leave the European Union, resigned his position after this, and Theresa May, after a short party contest and a couple other leaders who were under consideration, became the leader of the Conservative Party. She is no longer the leader, so she clearly has not served as long as Margaret Thatcher. She was party leader for 3 years and eventually resigned as party leader amidst sort of stalemate in the parliament in the UK over all of her Brexit negotiations. So this is an example of two leaders from the same party, and both of these women leaders came to become leaders under circumstances where the party was not faring very well. And this is something that is sometimes referred to in politics and in other literatures as a glass cliff scenario. So the idea is that women are able to break through the glass ceiling, but it's at a time when they are sort of perilously poised in a spot where it's unclear whether they're going to be successful or not, because the circumstances under which they came to power are pretty trying. And so this is sort of what had led me to start thinking about women and party leaders and how their experience experiences both becoming party leaders and then remaining party leaders might be different than the experiences of men. And that's what leads us to the two research questions I'm going to talk about here today. I'm going to talk about both parts of that relationship. And so the first one I'm going to be investigating is, under what conditions do women become party leaders? And like I had explained in these scenarios, there are several things going on when party leadership change occurs. And so we're going to talk today about how these all affect the choice of new leaders. So party performance at the time of leadership change, the inter-party politics at the time of leadership change, as well as the organization of the party and how party leaders are actually selected. And then we do have some expectations about parties. About parties and their propensity to nominate women to high leadership posts, given the history of inclusion within the party of women, the history of inclusion within the parliament in certain countries. And then we will also look at how the role of the party leader is different in different institutional conditions and how this might condition choices that are made for party leaders. After we take a look at the selection of party leaders, we're then going to attempt to investigate if there are different leadership tenures that are conditioned by gender. So do men and women serve different terms when they become party leaders? And here we're going to investigate some of the very same factors that we think are related to the selection of women leaders to see if they are also related to the removal of women leaders. So we're going to look at leadership removal through some time varying conditions. So unlike the one moment in time where a leader is selected, we're going to look at the conditions that change over time as a leader is in power and how they might affect leadership survival. These are similar things as selection, party performance, inter-party politics, and organization, and then the role of the party in different institutional conditions. So this is a lot to accomplish in 30 minutes, so please bear with me. Hopefully we can get through it. This is my first in-person presentation in a while, so this is also, coming out of hibernation, if you'll say. So let's get started. The first thing that I want to talk about before I start talking about how gender might impact these relationships is just thinking about party leadership change in general. And so there are certain times when we expect leadership change. And this is well documented in the literature. There's a great party literature about when we would expect leadership changes. Leadership changes oftentimes occur around national elections, especially after an electoral loss. So if you are the party leader and your party has experienced a big loss, you have not sort of delivered on your job to keep the party popular, to keep it running. And so you will oftentimes be replaced by somebody who might have a better shot at it, or at least, didn't lose it. And then oftentimes after a party loses government, there's usually a leadership change as well. So if you were the leader and you were the prime minister and you lost the government, it's quite unlikely that you will keep your job as party leader and somebody else will replace you. But there are other times that are unrelated to elections, or not completely unrelated to elections, but unrelated to election time, that are challenges to the reputations of parties. So especially in these days, polling is quite prolific. It's everywhere. If you're polling really poorly in the public, this is not a good signal for the party. And so one way to maybe help your popularity in the public is to change the party leaders. So party leaders might change at times of poor public polling, or if they're following a really big scandal. Scandal often is a time when a party leader will resign and somebody else will replace them. I make this comment knowing full well that there was just a huge scandal with Boris Johnson in the Conservative Party, and it actually did not lead to his removal. It turns out that I was just in Scotland last week, and everybody was all, the political scientists, like, I can't believe he's still in power, but apparently that was not a big enough scandal to remove him from his post. But these are times when we would expect leadership changes to happen. And then we also need to, when parties are in crisis, we tend to see a change in leaders. But we also want to think about how leadership change actually happens. And so there are different processes within different parties for selecting new leaders. And one of the things that we think are, or two of the things we think are important, are who selects the new leaders and then what that selection process looks like. And so when we're talking about who selects the leaders, in many parties, it's very different. So in some parties, the entire party membership plays a role in selecting a party leader. Party leaders will face a membership vote, and that will determine who becomes in charge. There are party delegates who might select leaders at party conferences. And then in other parties, it might be the parliamentary delegation, so the members of parliament, the members of the party that are in parliament, or the party elite, some sort of executive council that chooses the leader. And then also in a leadership contest, there are different competitive conditions. So there are not always leadership contests. Sometimes leaders are appointed. Sometimes there are leadership contests, but only one person is running for the leadership post. And sometimes there are leadership elections that have many different challengers at one time, and somebody has to win the votes, usually of the membership, in order to become leader. So these are all things that we think are important for understanding how leadership change happens, which new leaders get chosen, and how long leaders stay in power. And so these are the factors that I will be talking about a little bit more today. So the first question then that I'm going to consider is, how is the leadership change process gendered? If there are things that are happening to remove leaders, are these types of factors affecting women and men differently? Are there certain conditions under which women are selected that men are not? One of the things that I had spoken about before was that leadership change is often the result of party adversity. So if a party is facing a difficult time, one of the things they will do is change their leaders. Like I said before, this can be electoral loss or government loss. It can be changes in party popularity in polling. And one of the things that parties can strategically do to improve their situation is choose a new leader. And we have reasons to believe that choosing a woman as a new leader might be especially advantageous at this time. Choosing a woman as the leader can be a signal that the party is moving away from whatever space it was in during these trying times. And the reason that it can be a signal to break away from previous times is because there really haven't been that many women party leaders. I think it comes out to about 20% in the data that I'll show you have been women leaders over time. And a lot of parties at the start of our data had no women leaders. And so this is one very clear way to send a message to the public that you're moving away from what the party was doing before, not choosing a leader who looks like every other leader you've ever seen. But when a leader is chosen under maybe less than ideal times, it can have several different effects. So sometimes this situation is what is called the glass cliff, as I alluded to at the beginning. This is a situation where a woman becomes a party leader, but becomes a leader at a perilous time and can either do really well or is maybe poised to just fall right off that cliff and have that sort of be the end of the career of power within the party. However, it can also be an opportunity for renewal for the party because this woman leader is likely a successor that has not been linked to the previous leaders or to the previous regime. So this is a very public signal that you can send about who's become the leader of the party. And we know from other political science literature that women have some different leadership qualities than men. And so women tend to, at least working in the legislature, have been known to be a little bit more cooperative in their work. They have known to be a little bit more communal. And so it's perhaps more likely that women will work for the benefit of the party instead of just themselves in a way that some men might not. And so choosing a woman at a time of trouble might have some advantages for the party. And so this leads us to our first hypothesis that leadership change in times of adversity should be associated with a higher probability of women leaders. If leadership change is occurring maybe because of a regular scheduled leadership election or because the leader is resigning for personal reasons or maybe they're retiring from politics, maybe they're going to take a position higher up in the government or something like that, then we would expect that it to be less likely that women would come to leadership in those times. And then we need to think about the process of leadership selection. So not only are the sort of political and public and environmental conditions important when leadership change occurs, the process in which leaders are chosen is important as well. And so we think it's important here to look at the structure of the selection process. So as I said a few slides back, leaders can be selected in many ways. And the way that the recruitment and the selection is organized has gendered effects. To sort of spell it out, the way that I would like to describe it is if you think of a whole party membership is set to select a leader. We know when the entire membership is able to vote, most of those members are voting for the things that they think are best for themselves or that they think is best for the party in their own view. So you have a lot of people that are voting and they might not actually know exactly what is most advantageous to the party. So instead, they're using cues from people that are running for party leaders to make the decision in who to choose. And we know from a lot of sort of behavioral literature that people tend to choose for people who look like them. So men tend to vote for men, women tend to vote for women. And so if the whole mass membership is choosing the leaders, we might expect them to be more likely to pick men than to pick women. It's also possible that, or one of the things we know is that these sort of executive leadership groups within parties are close-knit political networks. And traditionally, women have had a hard time breaking into these close-knit political networks. So that might lead us to think that if the executive leadership of a party are the decision makers in who's going to become leader, they also might not think of women. But in fact, by the time women are in the party, are in positions to become party leaders, they've already sort of surpassed this barrier and gotten into this elite network, so where they are actually part of the decision-making body. So we actually think that decision by the elites is the one way that women can get promoted within the party, because the elites of the party not only know that there may be strategic reasons to pick a woman at a particularly troubling time for the party, but they'll also know the women who are there already, who are part of the elite networks and are able to just sort of identify them and boost them up. And so our second hypothesis then is that the more inclusive the selection process is, it'll be associated with a lower likelihood of women leaders. And by inclusive, I mean the more people who get to be involved in the process, the more likely it is that they'll choose women. And so this is the way we actually operationalize this in the research is if party members are voting, we expect it to be less likely that they'll choose a woman. Okay. And sort of across the board, some parties are just more likely to promote women. And so we do a little bit of analysis here of the history of inclusion of women in the party. Have there been women leaders in the party before? If there's been a woman leader before, we expect it to be easier for there to be a woman leader again. And then we also have a lot of literature in political science just about the relationship between women and parties on the left, and that they tend to do better in parties on the left. Parties on the left tend to be more supportive of women's interests, and to be more supportive of women in general, and to have more women in their parliamentary delegations. So we expect then that both left parties and those with a history of leadership will be associated with a higher likelihood of female leaders. And then the last thing we're going to think about when we think about selection is whether or not the party and the electoral system influence who is selected for leadership. So not all party leaders are created equal. In some parties, party leaders have an awful lot of power and are very much the face of the party. And in other parties, they don't serve this role in the same capacity. And most often we see this distinction between party leaders who become prime ministers or leaders of the opposition and party leaders who will not have that role. And this isn't perfectly distinguished between Westminster style and PR systems, but one of the ways that we're thinking about it at this point is thinking about the difference between Westminster style party systems and PR party systems more in continental Europe, and how they have different roles of or how the party leaders have different roles within those parties. We also think that when a party leader has the propensity to become prime minister, the leader of the opposition, that there's a greater level of personalization within the party. And so the party itself, or the party leader itself, has a much more sort of prominent role in the identity of the party than they might in other systems. In our actual analysis, we have 5 systems that we consider to be these Westminster style systems, and those are Australia, Canada, Ireland, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. And so our fourth hypothesis is that the relationship between selection and gender will be stronger in these Westminster style systems. So this is a story that I've told about how when we might expect women to be chosen to be leaders when party leadership change has happened. But we also think the conditions under which women are chosen to become party leaders might have some sort of relevance to how long they remain party leaders. And so this is the second half of our research. So if we think of all of these gendered effects, how is it that women's leadership tenures might be different? And theoretically, it isn't quite as clear how this relationship is or could or should be gendered. So one way we can think about this is if women inherit problematic political parties, so I say problematic in the sense of, have they lost some votes in the election? Have they lost government? Are they going through a scandal? Have they been experiencing poor polling? Then there might be a few different possible outcomes. One of the outcomes might be that these difficult conditions lead to a difficult time maintaining the leadership position. If the party is already performing poorly and you can't sort of bring them out of this poor performance, then the probability that you hold on to leadership is probably going to be lower than if you took a party that was already doing well and continues to do well. Poor electoral performance is one of the hardest things for a party leader to overcome. But this isn't always the case. So it also might be, if you take over a party when it's going through a downturn, it might be an opportunity for improvement. And it actually might lead to more positive leadership evaluations if you're able to bring the party sort of back up and back into good times, we'll say, instead of problematic times. So if you are able to deliver a strong electoral performance, this is one of the biggest things that can ensure your continuation as a party leader. And so we have to think about how this might be conditioned by gender. Is it the fact that women who are party leaders are being judged differently in the positions that they have, or have they inherited conditions which are making it a little bit harder for them to do their job? And when we think about it, we can think, well, maybe it's the case that they inherit parties and they're sort of set up to fail in a way, but that isn't necessarily always going to be the case. And actually, what I'm going to argue is that, but when women come to power, and right, like the women who come to power are generally really, really competent, really qualified women who have been in politics for a really long time. And so they actually might be situated to perform even better than similarly situated men. And so we don't really we haven't really developed yet exactly what our clear expectations are going to be about gender and survival. But for the moment, in this first cut of our analysis, we are hypothesizing that the impact of performance on leadership survival will be conditioned by gender, that there is going to be different factors that are conditioning whether women survive as party leaders than the factors that are conditioning whether men survive as party leaders. So that's sort of the general overview of what we're trying to do in this project. And right now we've got a pretty good handle on the selection of women, and we're just starting to explore the survival aspect of it. So I'll go ahead and present both of them, but we can sort of keep that in mind as we go through the results here. So now I'm going to show you kind of the data that we have and what we know so far. So I'm going to begin with the story about selection. We have selection data on 252 leadership contests, and each one of these leadership contests have been coded for why the leadership contest has occurred and what was the process of selection. And so coding for reasons means that we have coded in our data the reasons why the previous party leader has resigned. And these were coded from major media outlets that were coming out at the time of party leadership change. And so while it may not always be 100% correct why leadership changed, we can't know what's going on, like in the black box of the party. These are the public reasons that were stated for leadership change. And so we were able to capture whether a leader resigned because of it, whether it was because of a national election loss, was it because of a European election loss, was there a scandal at the time, was public opinion polls really bad, was there some sort of fight within the party, some inter-party factional politics going on that wanted to remove the leader, and we're able to document all of that. We also have information on the process of selection. So was the leader chosen by party members? Were they chosen by party delegates, party elites? Were they chosen by the previous leader? All of that to be able to say who's making the decision within the party for who the next leader should be. We have 11 countries and 45 parties. We are coding leadership changes between 1970 and 2019. And so in this data, we have about 81% of the leaders are men and about 19% of the leaders are women. So not a lot of women. There's certainly more women as we get further into the data. We have also coded whether or not at any given time, anytime a new leader is selected, if there have been any women leaders yet. And there's only one party in our data set that has a woman leader before 1970. I don't remember exactly which one it was, but it's one of the Norwegian parties. So most of these parties are experiencing their first women in power during our data. So after we look at what contributes to the likelihood that a woman will become a new party leader, we look at survival. So the survival of leaders in office. This data is a little bit different, and we're in the process of trying to match it up perfectly, but it's not exactly there yet. In this one, we have 172 leader terms. So each leader's term. That is measured as the months of leadership from the appointment as leader until the resignation of that leader is announced. The reason that it is less leaders than the first one is because we censor the data so that we don't have leaders who began their terms before 1979. We also don't include leaders who are still leaders at the end of 2019. We also don't include leaders who died in office or interim party leaders. So there's a little bit fewer leaders in this one. But the sort of gender distribution we have is roughly about the same. We have about 82% men leaders in this sample and about 18% women. And the average term is about 43 months. So just under 4 years, party leaders will stay in office. And if we look at the differences between men and women, men tend to stay, I think the average is somewhere around 41, 42 months, and the average for women is somewhere around 45 or 46 months. And so there isn't a significant difference in the amount of time that women and men spend in office. But we're going to explore sort of, even if they're staying in serving relatively similar terms, what is it that's sort of bringing about their removal? So let's see what we know so far. Oh, so I kind of went through some of this already, but we'll get to it in a little more detail. So when we're coding in the model, we're coding for the reasons for resignation. We're using actually indicator variables to indicate whether it was performance-related resignation, a party-related resignation, or a personal-related resignation. And anything that is coded as performance are going to be resignations that are due to electoral loss, any kind of electoral loss that happens in the country, resignation due to poor opinion pollings, and then we actually have a separate variable for changes in vote share from the last 2 elections that are closest to the selection of the leader, prior to the leader actually being selected. We also have a variable for whether there are intra-party reasons why leadership change is happening. So these are resignations due to a loss of internal leadership if there is a challenge or an election, resignations because of intra-party pressure from somewhere in the organization or the elites of the parties. Vote change at previous election is actually not related to that, and just I ended up on the slide by accident there. We also code for how leadership selection is happening. So we're going to compare it and contrast levels of inclusiveness of the selectorate. We consider narrowly inclusive selectorates to be selectorates where just party members are making the decision on who will become the next party leader. Broadly inclusive selectorates are ones where party members and party delegates are making these decisions together. And then exclusive selectorate is just the parliamentary delegation or the party elite. So these categories are not mutually exclusive. A leader can resign for multiple reasons. And so if there might be an observation in each one of these reasons for each leader, but these types of selections are mutually exclusive. So we test 2 separate models. That one tests the narrowly inclusive measure and the other tests the broadly inclusive measure with the elites as the baseline. And today I'm going to present the results with the narrowly inclusive members. So we're just going to look at the way the effects of having party members choose leaders. And then of course we have to think about the electoral and party system conditions. So we compare this across PR systems and Westminster style systems, and then include some control variables for right-left party ideology that comes from the comparative manifestos, a dummy for whether the party has ever had a previous woman leader. And then we do have a measure that's meant to kind of crudely capture sort of the status of women in national politics, which is an aggregate level measure of the share of women in the parliament. Not a party level measure, it's a country level measure in this model. So this is what we find. We do logistic regression with country fixed effects. And in the whole pooled sample of all 11 countries and all of our parties, we actually don't find much evidence for many of our hypotheses, unfortunately. The only real significant relationship we see is the selectorate type. As you can see with our inclusive selection variable, if party members are choosing leaders, the likelihood of choosing a woman leader is lower. And then there are some small significant effects for our controls for party ideology and women in the parliament, but by and large in our sample, it seems like men and women are becoming party leaders under similar conditions. But if you remember, one of our hypotheses is that we expect this relationship to be different depending on what the role of the party leader is like. And so here we have a model where we test these relationships separately, some in Westminster style systems and the other in PR type systems. So the blue in this picture are the Westminster systems, and the red are the proportional representation systems. And here we can see that there actually are significant differences between the 2 types of parties. And so I'm going to focus now on what we find in the Westminster system, because we have some evidence of different conditions for men and women in those systems where we don't have evidence for those differences in PR systems. So one thing you can notice from the coefficient plot is that there is a significant and positive relationship between the selection for performance reasons. So leaders are resigning because of performance-related reasons, and this makes it more likely that women will be chosen as the next party leader. And then there is the significant and negative relationship between the selectorate type and the selection of women. So again, we still have a negative significant relationship for party membership selection for the selection of women. It also is not the easiest to see because it's a relatively small effect, but vote change also has a positive effect on the selection of women. So as vote change is trending positive, it seems more likely that parties will select women as leaders, which is actually opposite of our expectation. Even though the other effects are right in line with our hypotheses. So when we think about the conditions under which women become party leaders, we can see that leadership changes due to performance reasons. They're actually associated with a 12% increase in the predicted probability of a woman leader in these data. There is also a positive association between changes in vote share and the likelihood of a female leader. So for example, if a party leader gains 10%, or if a party gains 10% of the vote in the previous election, there's a 10% increase in the predicted probability that we'll see a woman leader. And so while our first result supports hypothesis one, that women are more likely to come to power when parties are facing adversity, our second conclusion sort of does not support that hypothesis. We have mixed evidence for that one. But we do see the positive and significant relationship between leadership changes in the type of selectorate. If party members are choosing party leaders, it's associated with the 13% decrease in the probability of a woman leader. We also had the negative association between right and left ideology in the selection of a woman leader. So this is exactly as we would have predicted, and probably not much of a surprise for anybody here, but just the example I can give you is a 10% difference. If you move sort of from the middle left scores in our range of the comparative manifestos ideology scores to the middle right scores in our range, there's about a 10% difference in the predicted probability of women leaders being elected, in that they're less likely to be chosen in parties on the right. And then, of course, our last hypothesis was that we expected differences between PR and Westminster systems. I think the differences across the models give us evidence that there is something going on there, and there are differences in these relationships. So that is what we know now about how women are selected, how women become party leaders. So what do we know about women and survival as party leaders? So the next step of our research is looking at a Cox proportional hazard model to estimate what is increasing the risk of removal for leaders when they're in power. And so here we have our pooled sample, and what we do in this sample, so our selection model, our dependent variable was whether the new leader was a woman or not. Here, our dependent variable is sort of time in office and the relative risk of being removed at any month that the leader is in office. And in order to test the gendered nature of these relationships, we include all of the variables that we think are important, but we also interact them with gender. So you can see in this model that we have an indicator for whether or not the leader is female. We have a indicator for whether or not the members are selecting leaders, and we also have that interacted with whether or not it's a woman leader. We have a W variable for Westminster systems in this model. We have a variable for vote change interacted with female leaders. We have a variable for poll changes interacted with women, and so on and so forth. One's for multiple candidates at the time of selection, and whether or not the party leader loses government. The poll change data is a measure that measures changes in the polling average over the previous 6 months. So each month it's the previous 6 months before. It changes between that 6 months ago and the current month. And so what do we find here? Again, in our pooled sample, we don't really find any evidence that there are differences across genders in what will lead to the removal of a leader. So there's nothing really here to indicate that there's anything going on across genders that would expect sort of the risk of removal for women leaders to be higher than that of men. The only sort of small, like positive and significant relationship we find is for changes in polls. You can't really tell because it's so small on this table, but positive trends in polls is good for all leaders in this model. So if you're polling well, the risk of being removed is lower. But this does not have a gendered effect. So again, we take a look across Westminster versus PR systems. I'm not going to show you the results for the PR systems because will tell you right now we didn't find any differences between men and women, and so there's no differences there, which is exactly in line with what we found in our selection model. But we do find some interesting relationships in the Westminster system. And again, this is pretty preliminary analysis, so I'm just going to report coefficients now. We haven't done any digging into what the substantive effects of these are yet, and so take these conclusions sort of with a grain of salt, that they're what we're first learning, and hopefully we'll learn more about them as time goes on. So the first thing we learn, and you can tell by the very top of our chart here, is that being a woman leader is actually associated with the decreased risk of removal. So in the proportional hazard models, anything that is below 0 indicates a decreased risk of removal, and anything that is greater than 0 is a larger risk for removal. So our negative coefficients signal that it is less likely that in any given month that a leader will be removed. So this actually shows us that being a woman has an advantage in this data. We also find when we're looking at this model that the performance-related measures, the things that we thought would lead to leadership removal, are most important for men. So they are positively correlated with the risk of replacement for men, but not the risk of replacement for women. And these are things like government loss. You can see at the bottom, if government loss is positive and significant, but it is not in the interaction with women. So if a man loses government, it's not great for his tenure as leader. If a woman loses government, it seems not to matter quite so much. This model here is measuring government loss. So as I showed in the beginning, we don't have a ton of women. We have a strange artifact in our data that this variable of government loss, there are not that many women who have actually lost government. And so we're sort of limited in what we can put together in an entire model. And so this one has government loss in it. And then I'm going to show you a second Westminster model we ran that models selection competition. This one, instead of government loss, has whether or not there were multiple candidates for leadership at the time the woman was chosen. We can't have them in the same model because we don't have an observation where a woman was selected unanimously and then lost government. It's an empty set, so it didn't work in our model. And in this one, our conclusions are roughly the same, but we're able to say something about competition instead of government loss. So here again, you can see that being a woman leader is actually associated with a decrease in a risk of removal. So women are doing okay in our model, but that these relationships, this relationship here is actually sensitive to changes in vote share and competition at the time of selection. So those are two positive and significant interaction barriers in our model that are sort of conditioning this relationship. And again, like I said, we haven't done exploring into what the substantive effects of these are, so I can't make any conclusions at this time of how much it's reducing the risk. We just know that they're correlated at this time. We also see in this model that the positive trends in public polling is associated with the decreased risk for men, but not for women. So women tend to seem in this data to not be as sensitive to changes in public polling as male leaders are. And that competition decreases the risk for removal, but that this is only true for women leaders. It's not true for male leaders. So you can see the positive and negative coefficient at the bottom of the table is only for the interactive effects with women, not for the effect for men. And this is actually pretty interesting. And one of the things that I thought was interesting to learn from this data is that if a woman is chosen amongst several qualified candidates for leadership, that it might be better for her tenure to have come sort of out of a competition instead of being just appointed unanimously by the party. But of course, like I said, this is still preliminary, but our preliminary conclusions, one thing that I think we're confident in saying is that there are clear differences in the factors associated with leadership survival across Westminster in PR systems, and that we think the differences in the gendered relationships here are more pronounced in Westminster systems. But overall, women seem to be sort of fare better as party leaders in our data than men do, which I have to say it was a little bit wasn't entirely surprising to me, but is always a good sort of a normatively good outcome when you're somebody who studies gender in politics. But I think I know what you're all thinking out there. You're like, well, is this just the effects of Margaret Thatcher? because we have so very few women, and we have somebody who Margaret Thatcher served in office for 15 years and 8 months, and so she's one of the longest serving leaders in our data. But I'm here to assure you that this is actually not a Margaret Thatcher effect, because Margaret Thatcher is actually not in our data because she became a party leader in 1975. And we don't start the survival data until 1979. But as we might have thought that if you thought that these results maybe hinge on one very powerful leader, uh, you're not correct about Thatcher, but you are correct that it actually depends on these 7 women. So it's not that Margaret Thatcher is driving it, but we can identify the 7 women who are driving this relationship. So we have 7 women leaders in the Westminster systems in our data that are driving the relationships that I just showed you. They are Julia Gillard, who is the prime minister. She's up in the corner here, the prime minister and the leader of the Labour Party in Australia. Kim Campbell was the prime minister of Canada for the Progressive Party. She's here. Alexa McDonald was a Canadian politician who was leader of the New Democratic Party. We also have 2 new Democratic Party leaders in the center there with Audrey McLaughlin as well. We have an Irish leader, Joan Burton, who is leader of the Labour Party, Helen Clark, who was the first first female prime minister of New Zealand, who was then actually replaced as leader of the National Party with another woman, Jenny Shipley, who's I think the last woman there. I don't exactly remember whose pictures go through, but we know that these relationships are all being driven by just these 7 women. So while they are interesting conclusions, we definitely have some more work to do to see sort of exactly what's going on kind of under the hood. But one of the great things about this research is that because there have been so few women leaders that have come through in the past 50 years, we're actually getting able to learn a lot about who these women are. So that's sort of the next step of our project, is to look more into what was going on when these women were removed from office. We know those circumstances because they're in our data from the selection data, and so we're gonna dig some more into that. But overall, we're really excited about this project. We think we have some information that we've learned from the data. Sort of the main takeaways are that leadership change in times of party adversity is associated with the likelihood of women leaders, and that the organization of leadership selection is important. The likelihood of a woman becoming a party leader is driven by performance factors, but once in office, the effect of party performance seems to be less important for women, and these factors seem to sort of work in favor for women. And then we also have a takeaway about the inclusiveness of the selectorate for women leaders, and that if party members are in charge of leadership, it's less likely that they're going to select new leaders. But if leaders women leaders do come through in competitive contests, they're usually associated with the lower risk of replacement. So while we might have all of this anecdotal evidence that there's this glass cliff in politics, that when women get to the top, they're sort of set in a precarious place, we actually find in this data that when women get to the top, they perform very, very well. And so this is good news, I think, all around. And that is where we're at. And I am so excited to take your questions on this project. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you, Andrea, for this great presentation. So now we have some time for Q&A. So as a reminder, if you are following this talk online, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. I will first ask a couple of questions, and I will turn to the audience that is present here in person also. I just have 2 small, maybe a bit obvious questions. You talked a lot about leaders, female leaders in the Westminster system. You mentioned Margaret Thatcher, also in the very beginning. I think a lot of people here, when we think about women leaders that were in office for a long time, think about Angela Merkel. Of course, she was not in a Westminster system, but I was wondering whether you could say something about her and how your conclusions work or don't work for the situation that she found herself in. And my second question is about your conclusion about inclusion in the selection process, and that had a negative effect, if I'm not mistaken, on the selection of women leaders. Maybe I missed some of the things you said in that context, but is that the case because there are proportionally more men who are party members, or what is the reason there? One of the reasons why I'm asking that also is because In Belgium, especially where I'm from originally in Belgium, I think in at least in local elections where you have quite open lists, women actually get more votes in local elections than do men. I guess because maybe to some extent women tend to vote more for women than men do for men. So I was wondering whether it has anything to do with the proportions in party membership.
Mhm.
Those are my two questions.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to start with your last question first. Yes. Okay. So Christophe had asked if the result of the inclusiveness in the electoral system, the inclusiveness of the selection of leaders, is driven by the sort of composition of the party members. Are there more men party members, and is this why they are more likely to select men as party leaders? He gave us an example of in local elections in Belgium that women on the open list actually get more votes than the men. And the idea, correct me if I'm wrong, Christophe, was that women actually are voting for women more. And so we see that effect. And I think that I don't know the answer for certain. Party membership figures, especially going back in time, are always a little bit messy, I would say. And so knowing exactly what the gender makeup is of the membership is something that we don't know. We don't have in this data, but that is the idea behind it, is that party memberships by and large, especially going back into the 1970s and 80s, were mostly male, and so we expected mostly men to vote for men, and also that there were a lot less women who would come through in the ranks of the party at this time, and so they might have been less familiar to the men, or might have had qualities that the men don't associate with leadership, um, or that people in general don't associate with leadership. So, in any individual member of the party might see a female candidate for leadership and think that this candidate is not my preferred candidate because either they don't look like me, I don't know who they are, or I have these misconceptions about how women are in leadership, and I might not want to vote for them. How that relates to local elections, I think it is true in the research that women tend to vote for women and men vote for men. So if there were more women voting in the party, then we would expect the opposite result that we found in our data. So if I guess one way we could look at this is look at parties that I can't think of a party right off the top of my head that I would expect to have like a majority female membership. But if it had a majority female membership, then we would expect the masses to also choose women. So Angela Merkel, I don't have a good explanation off the top of my head for what's going on there. We do have Germany in the model, and we haven't tested yet. Germany, no, it doesn't fit sort of squarely in the PR system where the party leaders are less likely to become political leaders. It doesn't fit squarely in the Westminster, and so we're not quite sure how to situate Germany in this story, and we're kind of working through it now. But yeah, she clearly was party leader for a very long time. I don't remember off the top of my head how she became party leader. Maybe you remember the story how she became party leader and could tell me whether or not it fits with the story I just gave you.
I would say, I mean, Johannes can maybe say more about it, but I would say that she became party leader when the Christian Democratic Party was in the opposition and not doing well in the polls, and then the leader who had been chosen after Kohl also got him and involved in that scandal, or at least his name got attached to the party financing scandal. And I think that's why they picked her then, because she seemed like she was quite outside of that.
Right outside of that, yeah.
Is that a good summary?
I think the exact first. I think it's important because she was a chancellor, so head of government for 16 years.
Mhm.
I think she is probably the record holder. I think.
Mhm.
By the way, together with Mr. Kohl,
Mhm.
the interesting thing is both have been chancellor exactly for 16 years. You know, and Mr. Kohl was longer party leader. He was party leader, I think, for 20 or 25 years.
Mhm.
And Angela Merkel was party leader. I think she was elected in 2002. By the way, she was Secretary General of the party.
Mhm.
And therefore, when Mr. Schäuble, who was the party leader, got involved into this finance party scandal, I think and there was no competition. So she was alone, and she was elected in a party convention, which was the usual way to elect, I think, party leaders at that time.
Mhm.
Having all the members of the party participating is a more recent, I think, phenomenon.
Right.
At least in Germany.
Mhm.
So they are really record holder, Mr. Kohl, on the male part, you know. So it's really pretty split within the two genders, you know.
Mhm.
Two chancellors, female and male, and both have been in office for 16 years.
Mhm. This will be a very good case study for us to look at a little more in depth.
All right, other questions from the audience? Yes.
You go first. I have to run, so it's okay. Thanks so much. This is really interesting. I really am interested in the component that's looking at survival. And I wanted to ask the theory that you proposed of the glass cliff, to me, suggested not that we would actually expect to
Mhm.
see differences in the averages across men and women, but that the distributions look quite different.
Mhm.
The theory you proposed seemed to be one of a bimodal distribution for women, where they're either falling off very quickly
Mhm.
or lasting for a really long time,
Mhm.
whereas we might see a more sort of averaged out unimodal distribution for men. So I wanted to ask first if that's something you've thought about studying. I'd be really curious just to see the distributions of time.
Mhm.
And second, whether that might be what this competition effect is actually picking up, is a measure of sort of competence or quality that might be picking up who is going to make it into the higher sort of part of that bimodal distribution.
Mhm. Just writing that down because those are excellent questions. So I think when we look at the kind of those I guess hazard curves of men and women, it does men seem to sort of like gradually serve less and less, and it tends to be kind of a linear relationship there. But women is exactly as you said; they either disappear very quickly or they stay for a very very long time. Um, and so I think so the mean of women is really picking up the fact that some of them don't serve very long, and then we have people even though um Margaret Thatcher wasn't in that actual data, but people like Angela Merkel who are party leaders for a very, very long time. So I think that is what is going on there. And I hadn't thought about the selection variable maybe picking up who or sort of capturing who we would expect to go very quickly and who we would expect to stay for a really long time. But that's sort of the idea behind it. Like if the leader has gone through a contest for the leadership where there's been lots of competition and they are determined to be sort of the favorite amongst lots of very competent leaders, we might expect them to last for a very long time. But if they were appointed as a leader or they were selected where nobody else wanted to be leader at that time, or whatever happened in the party that there was no actual record of any competitors, then they might actually be the women who disappear very quickly. So I'm definitely going to take a look at that and see if that is in fact the case.
Thank you. The question I had was related to a little more descriptively what's going on with women in full systems, proportional as well as Westminster, and if
Mhm.
there's any difference, you can talk about that. Is it that entry is occurring later, and that is related to qualifications that may drive into the reason that they're are able to survive so long, if you will?
Mhm.
Or do we not really see that many differences either between systems or between men and women in terms of maybe age of entry or experience? Simply thinking maybe a lot of them are doing this, might be doing this, post earlier motherhood, or
Mhm.
might be foregoing that altogether.
Mhm. Yeah, that's also an interesting question, and we've done some a little bit of analysis with age. It doesn't appear to be age effects that are different between men and women, but I don't know the average age in which the leaders are becoming leaders. But you might be correct that maybe they're entering at a younger part in their career in PR systems, or but I don't know theoretically why I would think that is so. Um, I think one thing that is probably true in the data is that the women leaders who are coming first in the parties, the ones who are showing up in the data in the 1970s, in the 1980s, in the 1990s, are likely much older than the leaders who are showing up in some of the more recent years, and having that be sort of the pinnacle of their career. And it takes them a lot longer to get there than it does some of the younger women. But that's certainly something that's super interesting and that is worth looking into. So thank you.
Right. Maybe a couple more questions first, Jonne, and then Johannes.
Hi, thank you. I was very interested in the result that you showed where if party members are able to vote, then women are less likely to be selected. And similar to Christophe, I was wondering what your thoughts were, what causes this, because obviously from selection conjoint designs, like the recent paper from Susanna Swartz and I think Alex Kopok, we
Mm,
know that on average voters prefer women. I think even if we break this down by gender,
mhm.
then the result still holds up. So I just wonder, like, what are your thoughts besides, I guess, the composition of party members? Why are they a different population than apparently the average voter.
Mhm.
Thanks.
So why are they a different population than the average voter? Ooh, that's a big question. um, so party members. I mean, I would maybe argue that we might expect some similar relationships between the average voter and the party members when it comes to the selection of women. Um, but instead of a selection for a candidate where there is perhaps more information about the candidates going out to voters in the time of an election, in a party leadership election, if you give it to the mass membership, there may be less information about the candidates going out into the voters. So especially in the early years of our sample, my thinking behind it was that if a woman is up for party leadership and the party members are selecting, they may know a lot less about her if she hasn't been prominent in the party leadership. So if these choices are being made to sort of make a switch from the old guard of the party, it may be an unfamiliar face, and that face being unfamiliar plus being a woman might be sort of like two strikes against them. Of course, we do have all of this experimental evidence that on average, people prefer women over men, and trying to think of how that fits in here, I'm not 100% sure. I think some of what is going on when women prefer or when voters prefer men to women is that there is now, because of the women who have been so prominent in politics tend to be super confident and very well qualified, that there are expectations about what women politicians are like that are making people prefer women to men, and that maybe clearly we don't show that that's the case here, that they're making these sort of assumptions about women, but I don't know. I also think it's a thing, to me, it's more of a story about what's best for the party, and that the past membership is not always making the decisions of like what's most strategic for the party at the time in the way that the elite leadership can. So if the elite leadership really want to change from the old guard, they're able to do it by selecting a woman, but the masses of the party might not be thinking the same in that way and picking sort of an unfamiliar candidate for that reason.
All right, last question for Johannes.
My question is more a methodological question. I mean, we didn't have so many female, I think, heads of government, and party leaders. So my question is it just as we have drawn statistical conclusions, are they really significant? Because it could also be, if you have a limited number, it can also be very much by accident. So is it really, from a statistical point of view, is it really significant, I think? Well, that is very difficult, I think. My second point is, if I look, I think at least on the development in Germany and some other of the neighboring countries, I think what makes it difficult to draw a conclusion is it's a very dynamic development. So you see what you see in the last 5 years is completely different from what we had 10 years ago. It's completely different. The German cabinet is now half female, and that has an impact on the question you are looking into. Because normally people are recruited for heads of government, or party leader on their CV they had before, political CV.
Right.
So having a substantial increase, I think, in female membership in cabinets, of course, increases the likelihood you are talking about here.
Right.
So there are interrelationships, So I think this is the question you are looking into is very extremely important. But it's so difficult to assess at the end of the day, as I said, because the development is extremely dynamic. And the short-term development is, as I said, very different from what we have seen. I think you looked on the time between 1970 and 2010 or 19 or whatever, But if you look only, let's say, into the time 2000, 2019 or 2020, it will probably be extremely different. And even if you do 2010 and 2020, that will again be so I think there's a very positive dynamic development, which of course, because there are not enough statistics, then to get something out, significant,
Right.
That was a little bit what came to my mind listening to you.
Yeah, that's excellent insight, and I like what you're saying about how it's changed so much very, very recently. So the first time that we did a first cut at the selection, we only had data through 2013, and we found that there were more significant differences between the conditions that led to women being leaders than men in like the entire pooled sample. in the sample from 1970 to, or at that point, I think it was 1980 to 2013. When we've expanded the sample and added those extra years, we have a lot more women, and now we don't really see the differences in gender the same. So I think there is something about the last sort of 10 years that has really been different, and has been more positive for women. Remind me of your first question again. Oh, can we say something, because we have so few women? I think that's very fair, and that's why I put this slide up. Like, well, it's not Thatcher driving our results, but it is only these 7 women driving our results. So, whether we can extrapolate to the broader population of women writ large around the world, probably not. But I think one of the advantages of having such a small sample is that this is quickly turning into a much larger project where we can look at each one of these leaders individually and really, really learn about what's going on. Mm-hmm.
It's more difficult and more challenging. Looking on cabinets.
Yes.
Instead of just one person on the top, because I said, if you want to be close to what will happen in the future, I think the membership in cabinet is the key, let's say, preceding stages. I think you must.
Right.
It's very rare that somebody is getting party leader and chancellor, at least in Germany, or head of government, without having been a member of cabinet. So in this development, you see a little bit what will happen to a certain extent in the future. It's just an idea.
Yeah, actually, like two really, really great prominent scholars, Tiffany Barnes and Diana O'Brien, are working on a big project on cabinet ministers that they just got an NSF grant for. So they're already answering your question for you, and hopefully we'll have some. I think they actually have some research already that's come out recently on that. Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Andrea. This was great.
Thank you. Thank you for all of your questions. I really enjoyed it.
And thanks for coming all the way from the East Coast. And thanks to the members of the audience here in person and online. Thanks for being with us this afternoon. Our next talk will be in 3 weeks. It will be a talk about Catalan politics. So that will be in 3 weeks on May 19th, I believe that is. And it will also be a hybrid talk in person and online. See you then. Bye-bye.